Talks of David Solomon, podcasts on topics ranging from Jewish history and the Bible to Jewish mysticism, philosophy and thought. To find out about David's talks, books and more, visit davidsolomon.online. And now, here's the lecture.
So this talk, which really I think is, in my view, possibly the pearl of the series, because it's a talk I'm very excited about, but it unfortunately comes with a caveat. But I have not been entirely myself the last couple of days, so you may have to forgive me. We'll try and get into it with the same usual vigour. It hasn't been an easy couple of days. And tonight we're going to talk about the 16th century in terms of the century of the Jewish woman. And it really is quite remarkable, because if you say to most people, and I don't know exactly who most people are, but if you say to most people, name a Jewish woman from the 16th century, right? They go, and obviously there's the big one that everybody knows, but I mean, beyond that, well, if you don't know who that is, then we really need to pay attention this evening. That's a good point. And then, so that's probably the most astonishing thing about this talk, that I'm going to discuss amazing people, and they are all going to be kind of new to us a little bit, and that these people aren't splattered right across our headlines of history. And speaking of headlines, once again, every person I'm going to talk about this evening is a headline. It is impossible to cover all the people. I have to be very, very selective in a century that probably no century more than perhaps the 20th century gives us more amazing women who are not simply, that's interesting, she did that and she happens to be a woman, but women who are turning the corners of history and driving the engines of Jewish history, and even sometimes to an extent world history, and making things happen. And but even so, I'm going to have to leave a few people out. So that's tonight's focus. I'm talking about women, and when we talk about women, as I always say, there are two types of women. Don't worry, I'm not going there. When we talk about women in Jewish history, we're talking about women who are great human beings, who happen to be women, or we're talking about people who make an actual contribution to the very status of women themselves within Jewish and world culture. You follow the difference? So we're going to be looking at a little bit of both, and let's just remind ourselves of what we have been looking at till now, because it's always good going over the major issues. So let's do the map and remind ourselves of what's been going on when we enter the 16th century. We are not now going chronologically. I'm looking at the whole 16th century, and so we're going to be able to remind ourselves of some of the things we're talking about. So what's happened? What's happened? Well, let's just go quickly over the 3 or 4 major things that have happened and are happening in this century, or at the dawn of this century, that is about to change the whole world and usher in the modern era in which we live. What has just happened? Let's look at, in terms of world history, what's just happened? Well, that's slightly more. That is a world historical event, but slightly more localized to Jewish history. World history. We've just discovered a whole new world. And remember that it is not just the case that we have just discovered the Americas, which is so enormous. It's several factors of size of Europe. This is a whole new world. But also remember, and we discussed this just to show you how much we've learned, and that, or how much we've covered and discussed, is that while Spain was doing that, Portugal, that's basically Columbus, and Portugal through da Gama have gone down here and have opened up all these economic trade routes with the East Indies. That's very, very important. We sometimes overlook that today because we go, oh, that's not so difficult, just keep sailing around the coast of Africa and then you'll come up and then you'll go there. But it was a very, very, very big deal in those days. So, and also a big deal because of its economic impact. So that's one thing. The world has expanded, the age of the exploration. What else has happened? Of course, you mentioned it. We've just had the massive expulsions from Spain and from Portugal. Remembering what we discussed, that those two expulsions, whilst they happened within 4 or 5 years of each other, were somewhat different. Yep. Spain said, we're going to kick out all the Jews, and after we kick out all the Jews, oy vavoy to any, they didn't say the expression oy vavoy, but oy vavoy to anyone who is still here carrying on Judaism, whereas the Portuguese expulsion was, well, we're not really going to expel you, we're actually going to force you to stay here, and you're going to have to be Christian from the day that we nominate, but for the first, say, 20, 30 years, we're not going to, for the first generation, we're not going to poke around too much into what you're doing. There's big differences in what was happening in those two things, and of course, those issues got transplanted into the different areas of conquest that came under Spanish and Portuguese hegemony. I mean, a lot of people don't realise this. And it's not the remit of tonight's talk really to go into this in detail. This would be for another talk and another series more on the 17th century. But crypto Jews were being burnt and killed and inquisitioned and tortured in the Americas because the whole of the Americas was under Spanish and Portuguese rule. And it was very, very, very tough. Just as tough as it was in Portugal. So that's one thing that's been going on. And of course, as we've discussed, the Jews of Spain, who in the first instance spilled over into Portugal, and then obviously many tens of thousands went here and there, and subsequently over the next few decades, people were always trying to get out of Portugal as well. What else have we got going on? We have, of course, well, the Ottoman Empire has just now come onto the world stage. That's a very, very significant thing. The Ottoman Empire, of course, here based in Turkey, and by the first couple of decades of the 16th century, they're already controlling all of that, and they are pretty much far and away the superpower. The only thing is that they're not actively necessarily seeking to take over Europe. They wouldn't mind. They basically almost get as far as Vienna, but it is they are the big dragon. Don't provoke us and we won't provoke you, but if you do provoke us, then we can do things. This is a very, very big empire. We're going to be talking about the Ottoman Empire quite a lot this evening. And what else is happening? One more thing that I want. That's Italy, that's Greece. Oh, what Holland did you say? Poland. Yeah. Awesome. Poland. And we're actually going to, that's so prescient that we are actually going to start in Poland this evening. Every time this gentleman opens his mouth, it's like something intelligent. It's very, very good. Not that that doesn't happen with the rest of you, but it's very, very good. But I'm going to get to Poland. But what I was actually thinking of in terms of a massive cultural revolution, we've just had the dawn of the age of printing, of course. Printing is exploding knowledge, and that means also round about the time that the Ottoman Caliphate, and remember a caliphate is like an Islamic empire with sugar on top, has just conquered the land of Israel and the Middle East, the Levant. Round about at exactly that time is when the Reformation kicks off in Europe and starts breaking down the traditional order. You've now got the whole Protestant Reformation, which is challenging the church and challenging the popes and challenging the emperors, and whole countries are going to start breaking away, German principalities, England and so on, and the Reformation is a very, very big threat to the Christian world. But at the same time that all that's going, you can see why it's an amazing century. What else is happening as we launch into the 16th century? What else is going on? Well, we spoke about Salonika. Salonika certainly becomes big after the expulsion because so many Jews go there. Remember, I spoke about different economic classes of Jews, and many, many Jews who couldn't crack it into certain places, such as Italy, were going to the Balkans and so on. But I'm thinking, what am I thinking about? If you are...
They discover the sun goes round, the world goes round the sun.
Well, yes, Copernicus and so on. Science is taking off. all of these are correct. But I'm thinking more now in world cultural events. I'm just going to flop it out and you'll all go, oh, of course, it's so obvious. We all learned it at school that we're not even saying it. By the time we open this century, we are in the height of one of the most amazing human cultural phenomena, which is, of course, the Renaissance. And the Renaissance is a complete kind of revision, not so much of scientific knowledge as we will come to see it, right? I mean, but it's very, very humanities focused, and it's a whole revision in terms of art and literature and culture and so on that really sees itself as returning to the classical values of the ancient world, where the Greeks and the Romans actually understood how to make things look nice. So that is why, for example, we call the medieval period the medieval period. It's between ages. They just saw everything that happened between the Greeks and themselves as blah. And this was this massive revival of artistic and humanistic endeavour. With huge impact, because it is, as I said, it's the Renaissance that really then ushers in the Enlightenment. If you took, for example, a figure like Giordano Bruno, who is sitting on that cusp, if you like, of the late Renaissance. He dies in 1600, and he dies because he's burnt by the church. And he's almost half a Renaissance figure, half an Enlightenment figure. And what's interesting about when you read Bruno is you realise that for him, there's no real difference between science and philosophy, science and poetry, science and literature. He writes in a way where he doesn't understand why those two disciplines couldn't actually be expressed in the same way, which is a beautiful, beautiful thing. And perhaps the world has to come full cycle to get back to what he was saying. But we've got in 1500, we've got the Renaissance. But so I just need to background where we're at, and we've discussed many issues. But we're actually going to start this evening in Poland, which is kind of where we're going to end up. We're going to do a full circle. Because we looked, at the beginning of the 16th century, Polish Jewry is only really just starting to wake up, coming out of its kind of Boch period, where you've got Jews living there, and we know already for a couple of centuries that Jews have found comfortable homes in Poland and in Lithuania. During the course of the 16th century, we're actually going to see the union of Poland and Lithuania and Bohemia and many of those places into a type of empire itself. But Jews are just really starting to find their economic and spiritual feet at the beginning of the 16th century. And probably the most remarkable person of that very, very early stage, at the end of the 15th century, the end of the 1400s, and the beginning of the 1500s, when all of this balabuzna is going on right around the world, it's not really happening in Poland. Poland is not taking part really in any of the exciting explorations that are happening here. Poland is not really that taking part in the Renaissance, as if anyone who in Poland who gets up with a good idea is probably going to make their way to Italy. I'm not kidding. Poland is, it's called, but it has a Christian empire which also has relationship with the church. They are not really part of the Holy Roman Empire that's happening here, but they are allied with it. They're definitely part of the Christian world, but they realize that they are that part of the Christian world that is the closest to the Ottoman world. So they're like the first vanguard of defense against that. Once you look at that whole Poland-Hungarian axis. The woman that I just want to start talking about, because she's so amazing, is Rachel Fischl of Krakow. Now we know that Krakow is going to become one of the first significant Jewish communities in Poland, because, by the way, Jews by this stage were so keen on Poland that they would even understand the term Poland as Polania, here resides God. Oh. Or Pauline, or, reside here, says God. So they thought, oh, this is good, it's absolutely fine over here. And the various kings had some mixed attitudes towards the Jews, but it was really Rachel Fischel of Krakow, who was married to a guy called Moses of Krakow. And we know that there's another Moses of Krakow who's going to become even bigger later in the century, because he's going to write the parallel Eastern European version of the Shulchan Aruch. We looked at that before throughout the 16th century, which is this age of the universalization of the codes of Judaism. And her husband dies, and she becomes heir to his fortune, and of course continues conducting his business affairs. This was a perfectly, I wouldn't say overly common, but fairly normal thing to happen in European life during the Middle and Late Middle and even early modern ages. That if a woman felt herself competent, and certainly if the husband had been conducting his business affairs with his wife and felt that she was confident enough and stipulated it in his will, that he wanted her to execute the estate and to continue the family affairs, then she would do it. And we're going to see that quite significant amount in the 16th century. But the limitations that we now perceive as being on women in these environments, I'm here to tell you that in Poland, they hadn't heard about those. They didn't really know about those. So, and I know some of you are looking at me in a surprised way, but some of these communities were really trying to formulate from scratch what the status of various members of the community, of the Jewish communities, would be. And one of those was unquestionably women. This is the sense that we get from the amazing women that we're looking at, especially in places like Poland. Rachel Fischel manages to get herself close enough to the royal courts of Poland that she basically becomes the most powerful Jew in Poland in the early 16th century. And she has her son-in-law, her son-in-law, who is called, his name is Rabbi Yaakov Polak, possibly from where the concept of Polak comes from. But her son-in-law was Rabbi Yaakov Polak, and she has him appointed as the very first chief rabbi of Poland. And when I say has him appointed, meaning that the chief rabbi of Poland from the early in the 16th century was a crown-appointed position. And due to her influence, she effectively became the lady-in-waiting to the Queen Mother, who was Elizabeth of Austria. And so powerful was she that even when the Jews of Krakow were expelled in one of the first kind of Polish administration anti-Jewish edicts, they expelled everyone except her. Now, I know that's weird, but she was able to maintain a presence so that when the Jews came back, she was able to create the conditions by which they could rebuild the Jewish community of Krakow. Astonishing woman. I can't go too much into her at the moment because we have so much to talk about, but I wanted to kick it off with her because she's a type. She's a type of woman who is not constricted by traditional perspectives on what women should and should not be doing in society. She's just completely empowered in the way that she is acting on behalf of her family, on behalf of herself, on behalf of the community, on behalf of her nation. She's also involved in a very, very, very big dispute. There was a very big dispute. There are some, this is Jewish history, right? I mean, we've got big disputes now. And we've got big disputes in Melbourne, let alone what disputes were like in the Poland of the 16th century as people were trying to reconstruct communities. But what happened was that she married her second daughter to some dude, and then she regretted her decision. And her son-in-law, her other son-in-law, gave her a way out. And that is, and it's still it's still a thing in Jewish law. It's very, very difficult that you can have a marriage annulled if you have the consent of 100 rabbis. I can see that some of you have heard of this concept. This was one of the first great rabbinic disputes across Europe. Basically, Yaakov Polak, on behalf of his mother-in-law, against just about everybody else. And to an extent, was very, very contributory to the fact that Polish Jewry created its own identity and its own customs and its own version of the way it did things and its own recipe for gefilte fish, etc.
From when?
Thank you for that.
From when?
This would have been from early 1500s, so I'm going to say round about 1510 that would have exploded.
Because of the influx of emigration from Spain, or because of
No. There were some people from Spain reaching Poland.
So what made this occur?
Help me here. Be more precise. What made what occur exactly?
There's suddenly you're saying there's this creation of a Polish.
Yeah, there's a creation of a Polish. Part of the all I was saying just then was that part of what contributes to the creation of a unique Polish Jewish identity was the establishment by Rachel Fischl of Krakow and her son-in-law, who went on to develop, by the way, his own unique methods of Talmudic interpretation and taught them to students such as the Marshal and so on, who established big academies that she contributed towards establishing, were determined to create, for Jews coming into Poland, this is not Germany, this is not Hungary, this is not Russia, this is Poland, and this is the way we do things here. So that's it's a fascinating topic, and obviously people have could write a PhD on it, and probably people have. But it really kicks off. She's kind of like the first major communal leader that we know of in the whole of Polish Jewry, and that's why it's an interesting thing. She's right at the beginning of the 16th century. So in a way, you could almost say that Polish Jewry was established by a woman. Don't say that in certain shuls. Now, we're going to just shift, however. We're going to shift. There might be some more that will come to my mind about Rachel Fischl of Krakow, but we have to move on because we really... I need to get to Rome. No, I really do. And Rome. And so in Rome, and obviously you think the Renaissance, so you're thinking Florence, and Venice, and Ferrara, and Bologna, and of course Rome itself, where a lot of the money and sponsorship for Renaissance projects was happening, and Rome had a viable Jewish community. So people who are just skimming, as we are, jet skiing across the surface of history, are going, how is that? How is it that at the same time the Christian rulers here, remember there's no Jews in France, there's no Jews in England, there's no Jews in Spain, there's no Jews in Portugal, no Jews, they don't want to know about Jews. So how come when we go to Rome, which is kind of like the eye of the whirlpool of the Christian world, in Italy, not just Rome, Italy, are we finding thriving Jewish communities? How is that? And that is because one of the great ironies of the 16th century was that the closer you got to the Pope, the safer you were. The popes were not that interested in implementing the Inquisition the way it was being implemented in these other countries. It was to be sure they put restrictions on Jewish communities, both in terms of number and status and what you could do, but they let them thrive for the most part. Part of that is because Italy is not a unified Italy the way we know it since Garibaldi of the 19th century. Italy is a series of principalities and papal states, one of which, notably the big one, Naples, is actually still ruled by Spain. That's very important to know. And yet even in Naples, which was ruled by Spain, there were Jews that were allowed to live, and probably, when it comes down to it, the reason for that would ultimately be economic. Italy was creating lots of nice things, but it wasn't really at the forefront of that huge economic explosion that was happening over here, that was going to be fought out for the next couple of centuries between Spain, Portugal, England, Holland, France, all of that access to the Atlantic. And Italy was dependent on trade routes going here and with the Ottoman Empire for its economic viability. Jews were allowed to live even in Naples. But certainly in other places, in other papal states, Jews were thriving. And not only were they thriving, they were getting involved in the cultural shifts that were happening. And once again, we are talking about communities that if there were restrictions on what women could do in religious life, they hadn't heard of them. This idea that we've got now in the late 20th, early 21st century of, women, why can't women study? Why can't women become learned scholars? Why can't women become teachers and even spiritual leaders? They hadn't heard. Those discussions were answered at the beginning of the 16th century in several places, one of which was Italy, and one of which was the community of Rome, in ways that we haven't even arrived at today. At the beginning of the 16th century in Rome, they opened a Torah academy for women in Rome. And that's consistent with what, in a sense, was happening in the wider culture in Rome, as women were becoming more and more involved in the creative arts. We certainly see this as we get through the 16th century, that women are writing poetry and they are painting and they are becoming involved in the arts. And in the Jewish world, which may have not has as much access to the general arts at the beginning of the 16th century as non-Jewish women, but they were able to fully participate in their own communities intellectually. We have, for example, Pomona de Modena of Ferrara and Fioretto Batsheva de Modena. These were big scholars and poets, scholars that even the rabbis of the time were saying, can you believe these women? They were teachers and they were scholars and they were very, very well versed in Talmud and giving halachic decisions and corresponding with the rabbis of the time. It has to be said that part of the reason why this could happen is because these women were coming from fairly privileged backgrounds. Remember that if you were in Italy in the 16th century, it meant that you were basically at least middle or upper middle class financially, and you were pretty much from the financial cream. But nevertheless, these women were encouraged to become intellectuals, encouraged to become scholars, and they did. This is a remarkable thing that many, many people do not know, that there was a yeshiva for women in Italy from the beginning of the 16th century that kept on producing these scholars. I'm going to take us now into the real meat and potatoes of what I want to talk about tonight, because there's two figures that we need to look at. And so even though they are so formidable that it is in some ways difficult to know exactly where to start, but we'll start from the beginning, shall we? Do you remember when we spoke about the expulsion from Spain in the very first talk of this series, and I spoke about probably the most significant figure of the expulsion, the person that was really almost universally recognized as the leader of Spanish Jewry, who was exiled with all the Jews of Spain, decided not to stay with Ferdinand and Isabella, but in fact be exiled, and that was, of course, Abarbanel, Don Yitzhak Abarbanel. And his son, and where did he go? Where did Abarbanel actually end up? Italy, Naples. And the Abarbanels were not just huge scholars, they were an extremely wealthy family. So they brought with them a big fortune, and they were among the Jews that were kind of welcome to Naples. And they established themselves there. Obviously, it wasn't easy. But nevertheless, it was kind of clearly what needed to happen. Yeah.
Jews allowed to take their money out?
Oh, that's a very, very complex question. It depends when they left. It depends how clever they were. That is an entire subject. And if you were clever enough to be wealthy enough, then you were clever enough to know how to get your money from one place to another. And it also depended on what your money was invested in. I mean, people are not leaving Spain with like bags of cash. It wasn't that simple. And and some of the figures that we're going to be looking at spent countless hours and weeks and years working out how to shift around their assets and fortunes so that the authorities didn't get their hands on it. But many Jews left penniless. Many Jews left penniless. The Abrabanels, I mean, he was kind of effectively the treasurer of Spain, so for him to get his money out probably wasn't that difficult. And the Abrabanel family had trade connections right throughout the known world. Don Yitzchak's son was Shmuel Abarbanel. And Shmuel Abarbanel arrived in Naples with his father, the whole family, and Shmuel's wife, who was Don Yitzchak's niece, Don Yitzchak's brother's daughter, Benvenida. And Benvenida and Shmuel soon became the couple of Naples. Don Yitzchak lived for a few more years, but they kind of took over as the kind of recognized leaders of the Spanish Jewish community in Naples. And of course, they formed quite significant relations with the ruling powers. Their business acumen and their business connections were very, very welcome in Naples. And they also set up their home as a kind of an intellectual and artistic center. The Barbanels were very, very religious, make no mistake, and they were very, very learned, but they were deeply, deeply cultured, because that was the culture of Spain, of Jewish Spain. It wasn't us and them, it was a whole integration into what world culture was doing. To the point where she managed to become the Benvenida in the first instance. He managed to become the governess. Now I'm going to say something, you're going to sit there and go, oh really, I don't understand why that's significant, but it's incredibly significant for a Jewish woman in that position. She became the governess of Leonora de Toledo, and Leonora de Toledo already tells you that the Spanish are still ruling Naples, because Leonora de Toledo went on to marry the guy who is going to become the Grand Duke of Tuscany, Cosimo de' Medici. So she is the governess of the wife of Cosimo de' Medici. And by the time we get to the 1530s and the late 1530s, and this is really where the 16th century is so complex that we would almost need a year just to understand the background to it so that we can fit these people in. But by the time we get to the late 1530s, we are starting to see signs of the Counter-Reformation. The Counter-Reformation is a movement within the church that is clamping down on all of the ideas that are coming out of the Protestant Reformation. And one of the ideas that's coming out of the Protestant Reformation, surprisingly, given what we know about Luther, but that's a whole other thing, is tolerance of other religions and tolerance of the Jews. In fact, The Roman Catholic Church had been much more tolerant in some ways, but that was now all gone as they were trying. They decided that they were going to apply the Inquisition. Through her own efforts and through the efforts of her connections, Benvenida managed to stay off the expulsion of the Jews of Naples for about 10 years, and then ultimately the Jews of Naples were expelled completely. This is well after these expulsions. This is already, we're talking now in the 1530s, 1540s. The Jews of Naples were expelled with the exception of 200 families. Yep. Obviously the Abrabanels being among those. Shmuel died, and then Benvenida inherits the lot. And not only that, but she is the prime executor of his will. And that's very, 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 very complicated, because Shmuel had 3 sons. No, even better. Even better. This is more even Game of Thronesy. He has 3 sons, and 2 of them are legitimate. I don't want to shock people, but there was a time where having a child by a mistress was kind of like, the thing you do, if you do that kind of thing. And so he obviously, they contested. Then one of the other brothers fell in love with and started a relationship with a Portuguese woman. And apparently there were all sorts of questions at the high end of Spanish Jewry about the status of Portuguese people and so on, and all those little fault lines that come in. But that will, Shmuel Abrabanel's will, that Benvenida was constantly fighting, became a major conflagration, and that's how we know so much about her and about the life of Jews in Italy at the time, is because all of the rabbis of Europe were discussing this will, because it was literally a fortune, and it was being ripped apart by members of the family. Not nice, but nevertheless huge historical insight into what was happening. But Benvenida herself, who, by the way, in the 1520s, from Naples, had been a very big financial supporter of David Harouveni, who I've spoke about in the last couple of weeks, of David Harouveni, was written about by many, many people as an extraordinary person. She then moved the entire family ultimately to Ferrara. And that's important, because by the time we get to the 1540s, Ferrara is going to be the place where really Jewish culture is totally going to take off in Italy. She has moved the family to Ferrara, and in Ferrara they can then start seriously sponsoring the arts and literature, but she is also enabled to use her fortune to assist Jews who are being captured by pirates and in the many travails that are happening to Jews as they are on their escape from Portugal and Spain. We're going to see that even more in the next person we need to talk about. But Benvenida, in a sense, sets the scene for what really the next person who's going to arrive in Ferrara, which is really the central person that we have to talk about if we talk about the 16th century. I'm not feeling 100% right now, so I know that there's things going through my mind about Benvenida that I want to talk about just briefly before we move on. The thing is that Benvenida has, interestingly enough, a daughter back in Portugal, who was David Harouveni, when he eventually got to Portugal, caught up with the daughter, and so was able to give reports back about the daughter and so on. And here's something, look, let me touch on this for a minute, because this is huge. We have all heard of the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisition. And today, it's almost like an expression. It's almost just like an idea. Yeah? It's almost like what I imagine in 500 years' time, people will know that the Holocaust was a horrendous event, but it won't be something that they really feel existentially. It will be a horrendous event that happened hundreds of years ago. And so that's how we know about how we approach the Inquisition. But the Inquisition was mind-boggling on Jewish life. And of the tens of thousands of Jews that were still in the Spanish and Portuguese world, it was immensely dangerous and immensely difficult, and yet they were able to keep entire communities of crypto-Jews intact. And how did they do that? Traditionally, in the Jewish world, there are two domains. There is the public sphere of community. That is, for the most part, and I'm talking about traditional Jewish culture, and traditional certainly culture at this time, which is for the most part the domain of men. And then there is the Jewish home, which for the most part is the domain of women. That is how certainly it was perceived. But if you cut off one of those domains, that can no longer exist. There is no Judaism publicly. There is no communal connections. Then Jewish life is kept alive in these parts of the world only through women. And that is why, if you ever subject yourself to reading the accounts of the Inquisition, thousands and thousands of accounts, and prepared to be affected, and prepared to be moved, and prepared to be appalled, it is mostly women, one after the other, talking or confessing or denying that they were keeping the law of Moses, as it was then known. They didn't even use the term Judaism. They were accused of keeping the law of Moses. People would go through immense subterfuges to be able to fast on Yom Kippur and not have anyone know that they were fasting. But that's just one thing. There were many, 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 many things that were applied, and people would, and non-Jews and other crypto-Jews would report on each other. This is a tragic time. But women were at the fore of the preservation of this crypto-Jewry inside Portugal. And so Benvenida had a daughter in there. This daughter fasted twice a week. Many, many, many of the Jews in Portugal were fasting on an almost daily basis. It was just beyond imagining how difficult it was for Jewish life, and something that, when we wander around Melbourne, and we're completely free to be as we want for the most part, in our Jewish life. In other words, the ones who are telling us what to do and what not to do are not the authorities; they're the Jews themselves. It's sometimes wrong. And there's also the other cute thing about Benvenida is that we actually have some of her writings. They found in the British Library a manuscript of hers which contains kind of like it's a little recipe book for folk remedies that no one has actually yet transcribed and translated. So it's quite interesting. But all of these people give us windows. But I'm going to move on because we're going to look at perhaps even more exciting things, because that is really all background to talk about obviously the person that I'm assuming most of you have heard of, who's not just the most formidable woman of the 16th century, but probably the most formidable person of the 16th century, and probably almost unquestionably the most impressive and formidable Jewish woman of the whole of the last 2,000 years, and about whom it's almost impossible to understate her impact and her contribution to Jewish life. And of course, I'm talking about Donna Grazia Mendes Nasi, who was born in post-expulsion Portugal in 1510, and she was born as Beatrice de Luna. Her name, the family's name, was not de Luna the generation before. It was Nasi. And she was born Donna Grazia, which is, Grazia is the term for Hannah. So really her name was Hannah Nasi, but she was Grazia de Luna, or Beatrice de Luna. And her family was very, very much a part of this crypto-Jewish community. Now remember that in Portugal at this stage, they're getting away with a lot because, as I said, for the first couple of decades, the Portuguese authorities weren't going to look too closely at what was happening with Jewish communities. That came later, and it certainly came later in the New World and so on. But they certainly weren't allowed to be Jews. They still had to be formally Catholic on the outside. And she married Francis Mendes, whose Hebrew name was Tzemach ben Veniste. He was from the famous Ben Veniste family, a very, very prestigious Jewish family in Portugal. This alliance, which within the crypto-Jewish community in Portugal in the early 16th century must have been kind of like a major shidduch. And you see, but here's the thing, nothing is in a vacuum. And Francis and his brother Diego, who had shifted to Antwerp, because Antwerp is now kind of like, at this particular point, the economic center of Europe. And they were running a commercial empire, the two of them, that was taking full advantage of the whole new opening up of the trade routes to the East Indies and so on. But officially they weren't doing that as Jews. Of course they were doing that as new Christians, but that enabled them, that allowed them to get involved in the whole of the economic boom. She's 18 years old. She marries Francis Mendes. They have one child, a daughter, and then Francis dies. Yeah, well, it happens. And Francis gives very clear that his immense fortune that he's acquired so far is going to be managed jointly by his brother, who was in Antwerp, and his wife, his young wife, Beatrice. Beatrice realizes that her time is limited in Portugal because, as you were intimating before, the authorities were encroaching more and more to try and get hold of the Mendes fortune. And even at this early stage, the Mendes fortune was considerable, but she managed very, very cleverly. This is a brilliant economic mind that Donna Grazia had. She worked for several years to get the fortune out of Portugal and sent it in Antwerp. And then she and her younger sister, Brianda, and her daughter, Anna, moved to Antwerp to set up with Diego and to combine the whole business affairs. They were now dealing in jewelry, they were dealing in silver, and they were dealing in spices, and of course dealing in all of the economic shifting of assets and money in that time and in that place of the world in order to effect all those transactions. And of course that means that they were sponsoring various governments to do different projects, sponsoring shipping. This was a major, major empire, to the point where they even, at this point, what do you do if you've got too much money that you can't do with it? What are you going to do? What do you do? What do you open? A bank. So they start opening a bank. And that bank is already getting connections into the Holy Roman Empire. It's forming connections with Italy. It's becoming big. And then Diego dies. And when Diego dies, everything okay? Oh, this is like Diego dies. Diego dies, and then Beatrice is now in charge of the entire Mendes Empire. This was one of the biggest fortunes in the world in the 16th century. Biggest private fortunes. And it was okay because they weren't technically Jews, they were new Christians, But remember that she came from a family, and he came from a family where they had effectively been practicing Jews the whole time. And then she does probably the first, really enacts the first of one of the most remarkable projects that she took upon herself that she is going to continue for the rest of her life. So everything we're going to talk about Donna Grazia, this project she's doing right through, and that is that she enables and sets up very well planned but complex escape routes that were called converso trails going from Portugal and Spain, providing the people with money, providing them with contacts to get to either the papal states where they could set up in places where they would be tolerated, like Ancona or Ferrara, or ultimately to the Ottoman Empire, because remember that the Ottoman Empire had opened its doors to Jews. She spent incalculable, in current day currency, billions of dollars, saved thousands and thousands of families. It was tough. It was tough. The route sometimes had to take you over the Pyrenees. Sometimes you had to get boats here and there. But all of that was coordinated through her. And she single-handedly, at the same time, held off the full implementation of the Inquisition in Portugal from Antwerp for about 10 years through using her own resources to bribe officials. But eventually, nothing could stop the Portuguese shutting the door on tolerance, and eventually the Inquisition came down. During the 1530s and 1540s, the Inquisition came down very heavily on the Jews of Portugal. And even so, Donna Grazia continued to get Jews out until the authorities realized what was happening, and they started circling around her in Antwerp. So eventually she had to work for a couple of years to get the entire fortune out of Antwerp, and got it into, and herself and her family, just at the last minute really, to Italy. And that is why first of all in Venice, and then in Venice things started getting a little heated, so she went to Ferrara. Remember that these places are different papal states. There are kind of different rules going on. So she ends up in Ferrara in the late 1540s. Historians differ. When you do research on this, no one seems to know the answer as to whether Benvenida Abravanel and Donna Grazia ever actually met. I've seen different sources say, they were close friends, they had their hair done together, etc. Or some people say we have no documentary evidence of them having met at all. And some historians are even saying there was a bit of rivalry between them. But certainly with those two living in Ferrara from the late 1540s, and only when she got to Ferrara did Donna Grazia start living openly as a Jew. At the time, that there were certain papal states, the towns of Ancona and Ferrara and others, where crypto-Jews who had come from Spain and Portugal were allowed and tolerated to live openly as Jews. This is a remarkable thing by the papal authorities in recognition of their tremendous economic input and what they were able to effect in the different trade routes and through their connections and their wealth. While in Ferrara, and having come open and come out as a Jew, Donna Grazia opens her house to scholars, and in her first major sponsorship of a literary project, sponsors and has dedicated to her the first translation of the Bible to Ladino. So the first Ladino Bible, which we still have some copies of, obviously very early printed book. You can still see the dedication to Donna Grazia there. So already by the time she's in Ferrara, she's huge. In fact, in Ferrara, she opens her home and she sponsors various different projects, such as the Ferrara Bible, but she's already acquiring the title by which she was known throughout much of the 16th century as Hagaveret, which or La Signora. She's I don't even know the appropriate translation. I mean, Geveret means missus, but the mistress, the very, 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 very high level player, and obviously automatically fell in as the effective leader of the Jewish community of Ferrara if there were any issues. And issues there were. Because once Paul IV comes to the throne of St. Peter and becomes Pope, the Counter-Reformation is now in full ball. And already there's talk of the expulsion of the Jews of Ferrara and the confiscation of all their assets. Once again, Donna Grazia has to work. She only arrived in Ferrara in 1549, but by 1552 she is already relocating to ultimately where she knows she has to go to the only place that she's going to be safe, and she ends up in Constantinople. Now by this time, her daughter is getting older, and that's another reason, because the sharks are circling, the pressure to get their hands on the Mendes fortune, and aren't you supposed to be a Christian, and so on. So that's one of the reasons. That was a little bit before Ferrara, but by the time we get to Constantinople, effectively, this is a very complex story. I'm not going to go into it now, what happened with the daughter and the first marriage, the second marriage. She ends up marrying her Donna Grazia's nephew, Joseph Nassi. Joseph Nassi, who we're going to talk about next week, one of the most interesting characters of the 16th century, Donna Grazia's nephew, who ends up getting appointed by the Sultan as the Duke of Naxos. He had been doing all of this behind-the-scenes work with Donna Grazia's, obviously in collaboration with Donna Grazia, but while she was sitting here being Donna Grazia, he was running around, and he didn't even get circumcised until he got to Constantinople. Only in the Ottoman Empire could you actually feel finally safe from all of these tremendous pressures, but Donna Grazia only went there at the last minute. She still felt, right up until 1552, that there was more that she could do by being in the Christian world, but eventually she left it behind. However, the Counter-Reformation starts clamping down on the Papal States, and they realise that one of the thriving spots for Jews is the large and vibrant crypto-Jewish, or rather formerly crypto-Jewish community of Ancona. Ancona, as you know, is a port here in Italy on the east coast, and was a very successful free trade port in the 16th century. Given its location, the Jews were doing very, very well there. I'm not just talking about Jews that had always been in Italy. I'm talking about Jews coming from the Sephardic world who were renouncing Christianity and were allowed to live openly as Jews. This was a remarkable thing for the first few decades of the 16th century, but by the time the Counter-Reformation comes, the church decides they arrest everybody, including Donna Grazia's agents and so on that have been working in Ancona. And Ancona was one of the big, big spots for the converso trails out of Portugal and Spain. By this time, Donna Grazia is in Constantinople, where obviously she doesn't live in does anyone know Istanbul? A little bit, yeah. So she's not living in the Jewish areas. She actually set up this massive mansion she was living in Galata, but obviously people were coming to visit her. Within 2 or 3 years of arriving, she had personally sponsored the building of a synagogue called the Synagogue of the Geveret and a yeshiva in Constantinople. Scholars were streaming in and out of her house, and then she heard the news that came from Ancona, because the Christian authorities in Ancona said, "We are going to burn 2 Jews a week until to completely destroy the Jewish community of Ancona." And this was basically the 2 months leading up to Pesach in 1556, between 1555 to 1556. Using all of her connections and all of her considerable resources, she coordinates. This is the remarkable thing. After having done all of that, she coordinates the first ever international boycott of an entire city. When we talk today, in general geopolitical terms, about sanctions and boycotts, this was the first time this idea, at the age of the rise of mercantilism, she realized the political effect of sanctions and boycotts. And with the Sultan's acquiescence and with all of her trading partners, she managed to effect a boycott, an entire boycott on Ancona that ultimately brought about pressure to stop the burnings and the arrests. It didn't save the community of Ancona. It was over, but it stopped all the trials and the burnings and so on. Massive. And then, as if that's not enough, she goes to the Sultan and she says, I want to rebuild the land of Israel. Give me, please, as a land grant. I mean, do you know who the Sultan is? Suleiman the Magnificent. We're not talking, I mean, you don't just go to Suleiman and go, hey man, how's it going? Can I have a land grant, please? She sought a land grant for the city of Tiberias. The city of Tiberias had laid in ruins for centuries, and she rebuilt the walls of Tiberias. Those parts of those ancient walls you see today were built by Donna Grazia and about 7 surrounding towns, and rebuilt the whole area, planted mulberry trees because she wanted to start a silk industry, to put silkworms with the mulberry leaves, so that finally all the Jews coming from the Iberian Peninsula would have a place to go to live and work and create a whole silk industry that would happen from the Middle East. That idea, unfortunately, never took off. And we know, in fact, that as she's building Tiberias, we know from last week that at that very same time, it's really Tzfat that is thriving. Because Tzfat was on, as I explained last week, was on that economic axis between Damascus and Cairo and so on, where the Jerusalem and Tiberias just a little to the south, but nevertheless, and of course, it was going, but Donna Grazia died about 1569, and after that, the impetus to keep the project going was never really there. But make no mistake that everywhere you look in the 16th century, you will see the hand of Donna Grazia. This is someone who led the Jewish world effectively, economically and politically, for the bulk of the 16th century. When we talk about it being the century of the Jewish woman, it really is, she is the jewel in that entire arrangement. But once we are in the Ottoman Empire, then we really need to talk about one of the most fascinating subjects that is so little understood and so little talked about the influence of Jewish women. And in order to do that, I have to talk a little bit about the Ottoman Empire in an interesting facet of the Ottoman Empire that some of you will be aware of. Who was running the Ottoman Empire? Who was calling the shots? The sultans, but you know, by the time we get to the second and third generation of these sultans, they're spending most of their time sitting in gardens, looking at nice things, chatting with people. The really hardcore decisions, the empire was effectively run by an institution called the Valide Sultanate. It was run by the women. And it was run by the women of the harem. Now, this is not your 50s Hollywood image of a harem, right? Where a guy walks in and there's like 100 women sitting around eating chocolates in bikinis. That's not what it looked like. It may have looked like that on some days, but it didn't really look like that most of the time. The Sultan of the Ottoman Empire never married. He wasn't allowed to marry. In lieu of that, he had a harem, and there was no specific number to the women in his harem. It just kept getting bigger. We know that at certain points it numbered certainly in the hundreds and maybe even over 1,000, but there was the harem. Now, who was in the harem? What was going on in the harem? And don't forget that if he had a child by a woman in the harem, that any woman in the harem was only limited to one child, so that they would not create instability in the succession. The Sultan was going to be succeeded by one of the children he had from the mothers in the harem. But who were these women? Who were they? So what happens is that the Ottoman Empire is conquesting. I know the word is conquering, but I like conquesting. They're conquesting all over the place. And as they go to places, you might conquer a town or a state or a city, and you might say, oh, there's a pretty young thing, and she looks fairly bright. I think we'll bring her back to Constantinople or to Istanbul, and we'll put her in the harem. So most of these girls are coming from far-flung places, and they end up in the harem anywhere from between the age of 13 to 15 to 16, and the harem is a jungle. It's a jungle, and you can immediately see that it is very hierarchical, and if you want to get anywhere, you have to work your way up. And so first of all, you have to be very bright. And it doesn't hurt if you're very attractive either. How do you work your way up in the harem? The way you work, there's only one way to work your way up in the harem, really, if you're going to get anywhere significant. That, of course, is to attract the attention of the Sultan. So on the one hand, you've got to attract the attention of the Sultan so that in the first instance, he'll spend time with you. And you know what I mean, spend time with you. Then, if you give the Sultan a child, you're already on a higher rank. If you give the Sultan a son, then you're already amongst the top. But not everybody gets there. There are hundreds of women in the Sultan, in the harem, and you have to climb this jungle as a young teenager, lost it. And remember, they're all living in the Topkapi Palace. So no one can leave the harem. And no men are allowed in, other than, castrated dudes, eunuchs maybe, but no men are allowed in, except the Sultan himself. This environment was astonishing, and therefore the women who managed to rise to the top of this system were incredibly talented and powerful women and powerful people. The most powerful person in the Ottoman Empire at any point was the Sultan's mother. Her son had become Sultan. And obviously there was tension between her and whoever was the Sultan's favourite concubine from the harem. And obviously the favourite concubine, her son, would be the favoured son. Now, I've drawn a picture. Now, what I've drawn a picture, it's a slightly cartoony picture, what I've drawn, but it's basically true. You can all research it and you can say, okay, well, it's a bit more complex than that, but that's basically what was happening. So if in that world, so we ask ourselves, how are these women, I'm talking at the upper echelon of power, how are they communicating with the outside world? How were they communicating with the outside world? And here's the amazing thing that historians of the 16th century of the Ottoman Empire are aware of, but many people are not. They were communicating with the outside world, running the most powerful empire in the world through Jewish women who had the title of Kira. So the Kiras of the Valide Sultanate were all Jewish women. They didn't pick Islamic women for obvious reasons. They didn't pick men. And it all basically started with the Kira, Esther Handali, who became the private secretary of, probably if there's any of these women that you would have heard of, you've possibly heard of probably the most famous one, who is, of course, the Roxolana. And Roxolana was effectively the favoured concubine and ultimately the most powerful woman, and became the consort of Suleiman the Great. Roxolana had been arrived at the harem as a 14, 15-year-old, where she'd been captured from some boch up here by the Ottoman Empire, but extraordinary person of extraordinary looks, extraordinary intelligence, and so on. Now, this all started because Suleiman's mother and Roxolana needed jewellery. I mean, hello, Phil, you're in the harem, you're going to need jewellery, but you can't just take your bags and go down Fifth Avenue and shop for, or Collins Street and shop for some jewellery, or Chadstone, or whatever. You've got to, people have got to come into the Topkapi Palace to sell you jewellery. So, of course, they called in a guy called Elias Hamdali. Elias Hamdali was a very successful Jewish jeweller, and asked him to supply jewellery to the harem. Elias himself couldn't go into the harem, so it was his wife Esther Hamdali who began entering the palace in order to sell jewellery and consult on various matters. And of course, Esther, being an extremely intelligent and talented administrator herself, soon becomes very, very much in demand by Roxolana and others at the top echelon of the harem for her ability to communicate, speak several languages, write letters, and act as an effective conduit to the whole of the outside world. And that's how Esther Hamdali really becomes the first Kira. She is remarkable, Esther Hamdali. Obviously, Elias dies, and therefore she takes over the administration of all of his affairs. These were some big discussions, by the way, about whether women should become heiresses of their husbands' things. We take it for granted today that it's okay, but there were big discussions at the time about how appropriate they were, but these women were doing it anyway. They weren't listening to rabbis or administrators who said they couldn't do it, they just did it. But Esther obviously becomes fabulously, very, very wealthy in her own right, and very, very powerful. She's writing letters and communicating foreign policy of the Ottoman Empire, and she was the one that was the voice of the harem. And then, of course, Roxolana was succeeded by Nurbanu, and Nurbanu was the principal consort of Selim II, the successor to Suleiman the Great. And her chosen Kira was a Jewish woman called, she was, Esther Hamdali did work with Nurbanu, but the really close confidant of Nurbanu was Esperanza Malchi. Very close, because some historians think they were kind of more than close. But they were, Esperanza Malchi was like Esther Hamdali on crack. So she was actually seriously seen as the voice of the administration of the Ottoman Empire, and was writing letters to everybody. Even became became the secretary also for the next generation of Valide Sultans, and we even have letters that she sent to on behalf of the Ottoman Empire to Elizabeth I in England. Elizabeth was praising the quality of these letters and communications and so on. So it's a very, very not known subject, just how deeply influential Jewish women were in the administration and running of the whole of the Ottoman Empire. But before I'm going to finish in a couple of minutes, but before we just leave that subject, because I'm going to go back to Poland for one more thing, but just before I finish that, is that I've got to tell you that there is an amazing thing in history, and it is a very, very strong theory, and it is more than a theory, perhaps, because most scholars are actually of the opinion that this is probably correct, but I'm pointing it out, the fact that it's a shtickle theory, and that is that who was Nurbanu? And there are two fundamental views of who Nurbanu was. She was brought into the harem once again as a very young girl, 13, and she was captured. And she was captured in the Ottoman conquest of Naxos. And she was, in fact, Rachel Olivia de Nassy, the daughter of Joseph Nassy. She was, in fact, a niece or a grandniece of Donna Grazia herself. Nurbanu, by most historical opinions, was Jewish. And was brought, a Jewish girl, captured here, brought into the Ottoman Empire, rose up. I mean, you can look up Nurbanu and you'll see the research, a phenomenal person.
Where she captured which land?
Naxos.
Yeah.
Rose up in the harem, became the Valide Sultan, and kept this a very, very close relationship with the Jewish Kiras. And if you realize that all that's going on in the background while you've got Grazia and all of the other incredibly important players in 16th century political history. I'm going to finish. I'm just going to go back to Poland. We started in Poland. I want to go back to Poland. And I'll say what I said at the beginning, in that I'm really only skimming over the surface here. And I do apologise. I'm not 100% on form tonight because I am not feeling 100%. But there were... I'm actually having to selectively edit out amazing women. But just to give you an idea, back in Poland... and it's interesting because this woman is buried in Prague, and next week I'm probably going to be opening with Prague. But there's a woman, how do we even begin to discuss her, because she's so remarkable. Some of these women are only really just starting to come into focus for historical research now, because we are able to access a whole lot more documentation. But this woman is a woman called... Rivka Batmeir Tiktina. She's from Tiktin in Poland. And in Poland at the time, in synagogues, some women would take upon themselves the role of leading the women in prayer. I'll say that again. Leading the women in a prayer. I'm not talking about some, trendy minyan in Caulfield that decides to have women lead prayers. I'm talking about Poland, 16th century, a woman who would explain to the women that she was sitting with what was happening in the service, lead them in the prayers and following the prayers and singing along and so on, and explain to them everything that was going on. She had that role. But she herself took that role beyond and decided, like probably her colleagues and compatriots, that she was even not compatriots, but people at the same time that she was even unaware of, the women I spoke about in Rome. Rivka Tiktina became a scholar. She studied things that were unheard of for many women to study at the time. She was studying Chumash with Rashi. She was studying Midrash. She studied Talmud, and she became known. She took the title of Rabbanit. Rabbanit, ladies and gentlemen, Poland, 16th century. No one's freaking out. Oh, okay. Rabbanit V'darshanit. So she wasn't just giving spiritual decisions, she was giving sermons. And she was wandering around from town to town, and she realized that the problem with women of her generation is that they really didn't know anything, and they didn't even have anything to read, and they didn't know what to read, and they didn't know how to behave. So she wrote a book called Meineket Rivka. And it is a book that... It obviously was eventually printed. It was printed in 1609. It is a book that contains numerous ideas about personal relations for women, how to make contributions to the community, how to keep your family in line, how to keep your husband in line, how to keep effective Jewish life going on a day-to-day. But it's an astonishing document. And it was written in Yiddish. It is the first book in Yiddish. Full stop.
How different is the Yiddish then?
Oh, very interesting question. I'll address that in a second. And it is not only the first book in Yiddish, it would appear to be the first book by a Jewish woman in any language, and would certainly count amongst the first dozen of books authored by women printed anywhere in the world in any language. But certainly the first book in Yiddish, and certainly the first book published and printed by a Jewish woman. And it is an astonishing... Now, what's also amazing is that we didn't know about this book for about... It got lost for 2-3 centuries. You know, that's like nothing in Jewish history, but it got lost for 2 or 3 centuries, except that it was documented by Christian scholars, because they'd seen it. They go, oh, that's very interesting. And then, as a result of the research into that literature, people went looking for the book and they found it, and now it's been reprinted and so on. I believe that the difference in the Yiddish is significant. She's writing in a Yiddish, but it has been translated. It has been translated. The book's popularity was actually taken over in the Jewish world by a book called Orena, which became the kind of classic educational textbook for women, but that's more of a 17th century phenomenon. But Rivka Tichtiner's book is deeply, deeply significant. What I'm hoping I've communicated out of all of this is that the women of the 16th, Jewish women of the 16th century, made incalculable contributions to Jewish continuity, but also to world history itself, and did not see their status as women as in any way a limitation on who they were or what they could contribute to or where they could go with it. Yeah? When we talk, people... and it's not just the case like in the 17th century, like Gluckel of Hamelin and so on, these other famous women that we know about, who are fascinating, but these women of the 16th century, they are taking the world by storm, and they're running the world, and it's not seen as something that's giving us issues. So sometimes I want to highlight this point, because sometimes we think that we're inventing things in the 21st century about the status of women, and we really need to relook and see how things were done in the past. My apologies that I haven't been totally on my game this evening, but I appreciate you following all that, and thank you for listening. There are notes. Let me have a look here and see if I've left anything out majorly. No. I think I've covered it all. And interesting. One more thing. I just want to say one more thing. Will you allow me to say something controversial? No, I mean controversial. Yeah? People going to freak out? Yeah. Yeah. Put if your hand on your brother, I didn't. Okay, good. Because this is a point I wanted to make, and I wanted to make it at the end, but people are going to get distracted by the notes, so hold on 1 second. Right? Don't look at the notes for a second. I want your attention. Remember I said earlier that, there's always different kinds of debates and disputes and discussions that happen in Jewish communities all around the world, right? So a few of them happen in Melbourne. Some of you may not be aware of them. Some of these discussions happen at certain levels of rabbinic discourse, and the community at large is not always aware of it until they spill over into the AJN and so on and so forth. Someone gets verbrent about it enough that they write a letter or they write an op-ed, or some rabbi says something silly and they upset people. But for example, there is a big discussion in Melbourne at the moment that you're not aware of about whether or not women should be, check this out, we're not talking about Poland in the 16th century, we're talking about Caulfield in the 21st, ladies and gentlemen, about whether or not women should be allowed in their own minyan to dance with a Sefer Torah on Simchat Torah. Can you give a Sefer Torah to a woman to dance with, right? In a room just with women on Simchat Torah, all right? Now, whatever side of that discussion you want to be, and that's the controversial part and so on. And what's amazing about that is that Rivka Tichtiner, one of the documents that we have of hers, is this phenomenal 40-stanza poem on Simchat Torah, in which she describes this phantasmagorical, messianic feast it's called Simchas Torah, that's what it's called. It's a huge poem in which men and women are celebrating Simchas Torah together in the Messianic age. And that's 16th century Poland. And that's published, and that's not a problem for them. So just to remind us that, we're still on a journey within the Jewish world, and that the contribution and status and recognition of women, but also the enablement of women to participate in spiritual discourse, is still an ongoing challenge. These are not just interesting historical snippets we're talking about in the past. These issues are still with us. So I just wanted to point that out. Yeah.
Thank you for listening. To find out more about David Solomon's books, recordings and classes, or to support his work and teachings for just a few dollars a month, visit davidsolomon.online.